Hello, everybody. Today we're here to discuss the Financial Action Task Force, who they are, what impacts this has on the crypto industry, and some rather overarching and potentially harmful new developments. My name is Ian Taylor, I'm Executive Director of CryptoUK, and today on our panel, we have three distinguished guests from the industry. Siân Jones is a Senior Partner at Xreg Consulting, Pelle Brændgaard is the CEO of Notabene, and Mriganka Pattnaik is the CEO of Merkle Science. Can I ask each panelist, starting with Siân, to introduce themselves, please?
Well, hello everyone, and hello Ian. Nice to be back on Coinscrum Markets. So I'm Siân, as you've very kindly pointed out. I'm Senior Partner at Xreg Consulting. I'm a Policy and Regulatory Affairs Consultant, and have been, for my sins, a regulator. Financial regulator regulating what we now call VASPs in Gibraltar, one of the first jurisdictions to have had a regime in this space. And for my further sins, I sat on FATF's policy development group that unfortunately or fortunately, depending on which side of the fence you sit, is responsible for the regime for anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing. Now I'm back in the private sector and part of a team of, well, this week 13, nearly all former regulators, all specializing in crypto assets.
Thank you, Siân. Pelle, can you introduce yourself, please?
Sure. Yeah, I'm Pelle Brændgaard. I'm the CEO of Notabene. We are a fairly new company focused on solving different compliance issues regarding to the counterparties and crypto transactions, and particularly the travel rule is the main one that we're helping companies solve at the moment. I've been in the blockchain space for a long time, started my first company in the space back in 2012, and have seen the industry grow and seen all the different things that we're facing right now, and we're trying to help the industry solve some of these larger regulatory issues that we believe is actually shouldn't be seen as a threat against the industry, but really as a acceptance to push the industry forward.
Thank you, Pelle. And Mriganka, please.
Yeah. Hi, everyone. I'm Mriganka, one of the co-founders and the CEO of Merkle Science. So we provide blockchain risk monitoring solutions to detect and prevent illicit use of cryptocurrencies. So we're based in Singapore and now have offices across London, New York, and Bangalore. In terms of my background, I previously worked for a crypto exchange called Luno. I think they're one of the sponsors of Coinscrum as well. So during my time there, I think in the crypto space, it was very obvious that crypto AML was a recurring problem. And it was a big problem, not just for blockchain companies, but also for financial institutions as well as regulators. So that's when we decided to go ahead and start building predictive tools for the blockchain space to help bridge the gap between regulators, financial institutions, and cryptocurrency companies.
Thank you for the introductions. Let's dive straight into the questions. And first question I'm going to pose to Siân. So let's start by what is FATF? Why are they producing guidance for the crypto industry? How important is it to have a global uniform set of standards? And perhaps can you sort of focus on some of the key highlights of the historic guidance? What is the travel rule, and what is a VASP?
Well, I will do my best to do that in as much of a large nutshell as I can. So FATF is the intergovernmental body originally set up under the auspices of what was the G8, I think, at the time, now very much under the wing of the G20, that's set up to prevent the use of the financial system for money laundering and terrorist financing. And now that remit's been expanded also to countering the financing of weapons of mass destruction, weapons proliferation, we refer to that. It's essentially made up of the largest economies of the world. Just under 40 nations are members of the FATF, That number also includes a couple of groupings, such as the European Commission on behalf of the European Union, but in all other cases, they're the major sort of countries. And between FATF itself and a network of 10 FATF-style regional bodies, effectively 205 nations around the world are required, voluntarily required, but the effect is almost equivalent to a treaty. They're required to comply with a set of anti-money laundering and countering terrorist financing standards known as the 40 recommendations. And those 40 recommendations are the rules that banks and financial institutions, professional firms and certain businesses such as casinos and lawyers, for example, the rules by which they ultimately have to abide so that there's a common global standard. The rules actually apply to countries, and the countries have to implement those rules in their national legislation and regulatory frameworks. In terms of virtual assets, FATF, I think as far back as 2014, started to issue guidance of a sort. That time was just around virtual currencies, and they've been monitoring the growth and significance of this sector, this whole space, as it has blossomed over these last years. And back in 2018, it made a relatively small change to one of its recommendations that clarified that virtual assets and what are defined now as virtual asset service providers, so all the gatekeepers such as custodial wallet providers and exchanges and some others, that they fall within the scope of the recommendations. And that effectively meant that countries had to make sure that their regulatory frameworks captured virtual assets and virtual asset service providers. The following year, it published two things, a relatively short interpretive note that was binding on countries and a non-binding set of guidance. And that first set of guidance came out in the summer of 2019, so that's 2 years old. And essentially, it's really just to try and express how governments, what the governments together expect in relation to virtual assets and gatekeepers for virtual assets, in the same way as they have expectations on banks and others. It remains to be seen whether the particular approach that FATF members took will have been successful in preventing money laundering and terrorist financing using virtual assets. Some will argue that perhaps they should have taken a more specific approach, taking into account the technology. Others will argue that these kind of rules need to be technologically neutral. No doubt we'll touch on some of those points today.
Thank you very much, Siân, for that overview. And let's move the question now, and this is directed at Pelle. Can you tell us what the industry is doing to address and solve for these additional guidelines that are coming to play? Perhaps talk about some of the private sector initiatives, whether it be into VASP messaging standard, other industry initiatives across the globe, because we know that crypto is global in nature, and who are the providers out there that are solving for the travel for?
Sure. Yeah. So the industry, initially came in, and I think there's a lot of pushback from the industry around the travel rule, because it's the travel rule, as Siân can attest to, is really designed for more traditional financial institutions, and it is actually still intended for that, assuming we look at VASPs or crypto exchanges as essentially just a modern kind of financial institution. It is intended for exchanges to be able to essentially collaborate together on identifying and verifying who each other's customers are. So you can then manage counterparty sanctioned risk around that. So I think one of the big problems with the industry, well, with the way that a lot of the industry early on took it, is that they took at it essentially as, here's the government creating this technical spec for us to implement, without zooming out and looking at what the regulators actually want you to do with the travel rule. And that led many of the early initiatives just to be focused on a technical messaging aspect of it. And there were multiple different implementations of it. If you've been involved with any technical community before, you know, if you have one standards group, next day you'll have two, and then someone is in agreement with those and you have three. So we're kind of in that situation where there are multiple industry groups. IVMS 101 has been really the exception to this. So IVMS 101 is a standard that came out of pretty much everyone in the industry said, to be able to solve this, the first thing we need to do is to have a common data model that we can use to implement the travel rule. And as I mentioned, the travel rule is this collaborative approach to performing counterparty verification for an exchange. So it requires the originating exchange to go in and exchange enough information to the beneficiary exchange that they can first of all verify that this is indeed going to their customer. And then that it also gives the beneficiary exchange a chance to perform a sanction screen. And that's really what the outline of the travel rule is. And that's what most of these, what IVMS 101 set out to do. What's the minimum required? How do we actually do that? And then there's a bunch of other industry protocols sitting on top of them. So, so there is OpenVASP, TRP, TRISA, US Travel Rule Working Group are some examples of the open, well, I'd hesitate to call all of them open, but there are definitely, you know, there are some open standards and then there are some closed standards. And there's been different approaches to it from the industry. So for example, the US Travel Rule Working Group, they took a very US-centric view on it, where they're saying, we are a couple of the largest exchanges in the US, we're gonna solve it for us, and then we'll figure out how to expand that elsewhere, outside. And it's also intended specifically to solve the US implementation of the travel rule, which is actually much older than the FATF version of it. But one of the biggest problems that we're seeing with all of these different industry protocols is that most businesses have been waiting to figure out which one do we pick. But that's actually probably the least interesting problem here for a crypto exchange. The most important thing is to do is, how are you actually planning on implementing it? Because implementing it requires a whole bunch of changes throughout your company. You need to change your withdrawal flow, there's a lot of interactions with your customer that you need to change. You need to change your backend flows. There's a whole bunch of new compliance tasks for your compliance team to deal with. And this is why it's really important, we believe, to actually look at solving these aspects, and then the messaging part of it will kind of solve itself after the fact. So there are, as I mentioned, there are multiple travel rule protocols out there, which are essentially messaging systems, some closed, some commercial, some open. And they're basically just protocols. So at Notabene, we designed a way to kind of, we'll handle figuring out which protocols are live and being able to interact across them. You don't have to worry about that. But really what the main thing that we focus on is actually helping companies figure out these really actually much harder tasks. What do I need to do to change in my backend? How do I change our whole operations, our security, compliance, all of these kinds of aspects of it. And I don't think many people in the industry quite realize how complex this actually is. So we've built up a lot of experience because we've been able to speak with, we've been working with a lot of companies, particularly in Singapore initially, where they've been faced with these real headaches. And I think it's important for the industry to start looking at solving these. Start early, think, how do we do this? So it's not like it's not a last minute thing. Oh, we need to be live with this in a month. Once the FCA in the UK decide that this is something that you need to implement, it's something to start thinking about early. Another point to this that I also just want to point out is that the travel rule, it's not as, unlike many other kind of solutions in RegTech, this is not a tool that you just use for yourself. The definition of it is that you're interacting with another exchange that may very well be in another jurisdiction. And this is a complexity that also I think few people kind of realize the difference here. But if you're in the UK and there's £1,000 threshold, for example, and you are sending a transaction to Singapore where there's a $0 threshold, how do you reconcile that? You need to be able to not just focus on your regulator, you also have to focus on your counterparty's regulator. And in the case that your regulator is not requiring the travel rule yet, you may still need to implement the travel rule to continue to transact the way that you've been doing before. So it is a complex issue, and the industry's, working hard on trying to solve it. But I still feel that there are a lot of people who just haven't started thinking through the consequences of this, what this actually means to their business.
Thank you. And yeah, I think we all agree this is not an easy problem to solve. Okay, let's move the question on, and I'll pose this question to Mriganka, please. We see that 52 jurisdictions self-report that they have implemented the updated FATF guidance. But out of that number, we only see 3 that have the travel rule in place. So what are the remaining 49 countries doing? Perhaps in your experience at Merkle Science, you can talk about the jurisdictions that you're aware of that have implemented it, why, and perhaps that goes back to Pelle's point, why only a handful have implemented it, talk about some of the interoperability and the regulatory enforcement issues that Pelle mentioned.
Yeah, absolutely. I think, so there was the number 3 that you mentioned. So I think to a certain extent, that's like Singapore and Switzerland have been relatively ahead of the curve in terms of adapting to the travel rule. There is some, I guess, controversy around who the third player is. I think what we've seen is Japan and Korea, to a certain extent, have also been putting forth guidelines. I think Korean exchanges have to abide by the travel rule by the end of the year, September. So there is an intrinsic issue with the travel rule. I think Pelle mentioned this before. The fact that it's cross-jurisdictional and that there's the intrinsic sunrise issue where a VASP in Singapore could be compliant, but if they're interacting with a VASP in a non-compliant region, how do they enforce the travel rule, or are they not being forced to become non-compliant in that manner? So I think that's one of the major reasons why all the other jurisdictions you mentioned, they've at least updated their AML guidelines to a certain extent, talked about cryptocurrency AML. In passing, a lot of their existing regulatory frameworks also cover the travel rule, because it is a concept from, like in the US, the Bank Secrecy Act, essentially, where if 2 financial institutions interact, they need to transfer information to each other of their users. So I think that's how they've already implemented it in principle, but there's a lot of ambiguity around how they're going to enforce it. And they've also been waiting for more guidance from both the FATF as well as the industry on how they're going to do it, and what should the guidance be that they give to VASPs within their jurisdiction. So I think the whole balancing act, where they're trying to balance and not hamper innovation, but be compliant with the FATF travel rule requirements, is the major blocker there. Again, like from our experience, like Pelle mentioned, in Singapore, we saw customers asking for a travel rule solution much before the other jurisdictions, or they'd woken up, even if they weren't implementing something, they have they were starting to do their research and learning about it. The second big issue was that there was a huge education problem. Most of the solutions out there are all protocols, and then the people in the compliance team either come from traditional finance, where they understand financial services, they don't understand protocols, and this is a completely new paradigm for them. So it was a very difficult thing for them to understand. And in Singapore, we've seen most companies just come up with a framework, a bunch of sequences, like if this is how they want to implement travel rule, this is scenario 1, and this is scenario 2, and this is scenario 3. And as it gains more mainstream adoption, they will start moving from a closed loop adoption to a large scale adoption. And that has been sufficient for now, but I think as the industry progresses, by the end of the year, we will see a lot of exchanges dealing with the travel rule end to end. I think just 2 days ago, there was also the announcement, right? There was a public announcement that the US travel rule solution made by the larger exchanges, they've talked about it. And now the third biggest problem, the interoperability problem, also needs to be solved, where there's a lot of protocols, and I think companies like Notabene are trying to aggregate the protocols, but each of them have certain intrinsic characteristics which stop them from being as easily interoperable as well. So when we've gone down the workflow with some of the other travel rule protocols, we realize this, like they require the customer not just to make changes on the back end, but also change something in terms of how they send transactions or send a particular message in some cases, until which that protocol doesn't apply. So I think those 3 are the primary difficulties: the fact that it's cross-jurisdictional, the fact that it's difficult to understand, and it's very easy to say the word interoperable, but like doing it is a whole different task in itself, because every stakeholder has a different agenda and different alignment in terms of how their solution is progressing.
Thank you. Let's now perhaps get current. So Siân, a few months ago, FATF proposed additional guidance regarding the definition of a VASP. Now, what was the significance of this, and perhaps focus on decentralized finance with regards to the additional guidance for what is a VASP?
So it's important perhaps to make clear that the definition of a VASP was set out in 2018 in that initial clarification and the recommendations. That hasn't changed. The difficulty is always then interpreting some high-level statements and drilling them down into what that means in the real world. And the guidance, both the initial guidance went some way to doing that. But of course, this is a very fast-moving space, and new stuff happens every week, month, quarter, year. So it becomes then less and less clear. Probably when much of this was first written, the guidance, DeFi was not really that much of a thing, and now DeFi is largely the thing. And so it's become very important to be able to define the touch points. What makes someone a virtual asset service provider, and therefore someone whom countries need to include within their AML regimes, when you don't have traditional gatekeepers, centralized exchanges, for example. How do you define that? Some would hope that simply means they're outside the system. Sadly, countries don't quite see it that way, and countries don't see that there's a reason for their intentions, their expectations not to be met, however something is structured. So you're quite right. In March this year, FATF published a draft of the updated guidance. So not so much additional as updated and expanded. They put that out for consultation, and that went on for about a month. And frankly, that was a reasonable time perhaps for consultation, and industry responded to that, and they received a very large number of responses. And so we might well see some changes to the draft revised guidance. I think now that certain decisions have been put back from the plenary, which is where things are decided, which took place the week before this recording, they've put that back to the next plenary in October of this year. So that gives a bit more breathing space for that feedback to be considered. The proposed updated guidance really says that FATF members don't believe that very much can be truly decentralized, in the sense that stuff doesn't just emerge out of the blue, but it emerges because people have put it there. And when they then try to explain who a VASP is, they, extending beyond the sort of old type of notion, you've got a bank or you've got a centralized exchange, and said, well, in a decentralized world, just because some part of it is decentralized, there will be some parts that are in some way, shape or form centralized, some parts that are developed, deployed, launched, whatever, maintained even, that are put out there. And people who do that are probably the ones who would be considered in many cases to be VASPs. Now, there isn't a single definition of DeFi, so how one should, apply that concept depends on the detail, if you like, of a particular project. But the notion is that, and this is certainly made much clearer in the proposed updated guidance, that interpretation should be treated extensively, that they should be considered broadly, and they should be considered from the perspective of including in as much as possible, rather than limiting and keeping substantial parts outside. If you want to police a financial system or a part of the financial system, then the thinking of countries is that you want to include as many as possible, not exclude a good chunk. And this will have all sorts of very interesting consequences. Maybe we'll have time later to talk about that. Probably one other last point to mention. So that much has been talked about the travel rule, but the travel rule is, of course, just one component of a whole set of processes that financial businesses, including virtual asset service providers, is just one process. And so knowing one's customer, identifying them, verifying their identity, understanding what they're going to use your services for, and making sure that that is what they actually use your services for. And if they deviate from that, that you understand that why and for what purpose. Those are written into the other parts of the recommendations. And the travel just deals with the part that says that information about the originator of a transaction and the intended recipient or beneficiary should pass from an originating VASP to a beneficiary VASP. In other words, in those circumstances where there's a VASP at both ends. That's just one component, but in the new guidance, it goes on a little bit further to explain that just as with banks and banks having to understand their counterparties or their counterpart banks or their correspondent banks, different terms apply, VASPs must also understand their counterpart VASPs. So if there are VASPs at the other end of a transaction, they need to know about those VASPs, know what their AML processes are, risk rate them if they're in a jurisdiction that is lightly regulated or indeed not yet regulated, then they need to take that into account as to whether or not a transaction might carry a higher risk of involving laundered money, illicit funds. there are many components to the process of AML, and I'm afraid VASPs, and clearly the definition of VASPs, as I've indicated, is now to be regarded much more broadly. You could be someone who simply codes a DeFi project and is rewarded for one's efforts by an allocation of an underlying token. That could actually make you a VASP. That's quite a big leap from where we were with centralized exchanges to this much broader concept. And so you can imagine some of the difficulties, for example, of someone in that role understanding who the users of that DeFi protocol are, and indeed being able to carry out due diligence on other VASPs who may be sitting at the other end of a swapped DeFi protocol. The implications are really substantial.
Thank you, Siân. That's super interesting, and just from our side, the industry, if you consider purely peer-to-peer transactions, swapping one token in another token in a decentralized platform, it does create a whole suite of challenges that everyone operating these protocols should be thinking about this, and at least joining any of these groups to have a discussion. And so to Pelle, let me ask you, why do you think this updated guidance has been delayed until October? Do you believe that the guidance, when it is released, will be significantly revised from what we've seen in the consultation? And talk about sort of the industry's response to the additional guidance.
I was muted there, my apologies. I think that probably the main reason why it's been delayed was a lot of the industry response that we jointly created earlier this year to the first, to the proposed draft of it. And within that, I think one of the main areas that there was a lot of pushback on is the area that Siân was covering here around DeFi and some of these aspects there. On the travel rule, there's probably not going to be too many changes in there. I think most people in the industry felt that the updates over previous versions of it actually were quite good and essentially clarified most of the questions that the industry had there. There's still a couple of things in there, such as the term correspondent banking. I've been pushing back on that term because it's not exactly the same as, but it is important to focus on the due diligence aspect of it, and you do need to understand how that works. And I know Siân and her team are working on tools and making this a lot easier, but you do need to understand, can you trust this counterparty exchange? They've done their job. So I think we will, I hope a lot of the DeFi things will be clarified, the language. And I think there's a lot of misunderstanding also, I think, on what was in that, all of this mentioning in there. So they do all of these things. You may be a VASP if you do these different things, but they also don't say that you are a VASP if you don't do those things. So my understanding from it, and actually also some of the things that I've heard specifically from members of FATF, is that this is more kind of like a warning shot in some respects to the industry, to DeFi, to try and figure out, when you're creating a DeFi protocol, how can you create a regulated version of it? Who should be taking on the regulatory compliance issues within a DeFi protocol? And that isn't necessarily the protocol themselves. And there's definitely a lot of precedent for this, because I mean, that's what we saw with Ethereum, with Bitcoin. They understand these are decentralized protocols, and the VASPs themselves are taking on the specific roles here. And I think that's really the right way to approach it. But it is also important for the industry to take it serious. And I think that's really where this push is. And I think there is also a lot of back and forth now, which is probably one of the reasons why it's been delayed. delayed a bit, which means that it probably had the effect that FATF actually wanted from it to, have the industry, wake up and see, okay, how do we solve this? I'm definitely seeing a lot of people in the industry trying to be collaborative around this, trying to solve these issues.
Thank you, Pelle. I wanted to mention that half a dozen trade bodies across the globe have gotten together to really drive the debate to make sure that we don't over-regulate this new subset of the crypto asset market. The Global DeFi Coalition has produced a set of statements that we sent to FATF and also will send to each of the major governments to just sort of raise and focus on the societal benefits that some of these DeFi projects and protocols can offer, and not to focus on necessarily the risks of economic crime and how we can solve for that. And so that leads me into the final question. So Mriganka, can you sort of suggest what could be some of the unintended consequences if we see a full rollout of the suggested guidance? How can we as an industry sort of work to achieve the right outcomes, especially around privacy and perhaps pushing things to dark markets or not across centralized exchanges?
Yeah, absolutely. I think one of the key things with this updated guidance was that the definition was left too broad, and like certain types of companies, certain types of DeFi companies or NFTs may be VASPs if they operate in a certain manner. So I think that was definitely something that could be misinterpreted and might lead to the peer-to-peer model completely getting restricted in a lot of jurisdictions. I also felt that, again, the language in some areas are kept open-ended. So with respect to peer-to-peer transactions, I think that updated guidance has talked about the fact that a particular jurisdiction could even choose not to license a VASP if they're dealing with a lot of peer-to-peer transactions, or they may choose to just enforce stricter AML requirements on them. So I think there might be a slight negative stance towards peer-to-peer transactions or DEXs. It might be unintended as well. So I think that's something that could be fixed. Just a few days ago, I was reading a tweet by the Blockchain Association. So they've also talked about how a framework meant for centralized bodies like banks is being applied to DeFi, which is a new industry of its own. So I think there might be a bit of a lack of fit there, where you might need to modify the framework to suit this nature of DeFi companies. I think otherwise the big problem would be that new industries would be stifled. And the second biggest problem would also be that most of these regulators across the world, their enforcement costs would be too high to enforce. It is much easier to enforce all the banks in a particular country than to start enforcing all the DeFi protocols that may be linked to a particular country, right? So more guidance and limiting the definition to a certain extent and giving very clear guidance both to the industry as well as the regulator in terms of what needs to be done for the enforcement could be a good way to modify or update the proposal. I think that's why there's a reason for the delay as well, that they want to make sure that they take as much data as possible of all the different segments and how relevant each of them are in terms of AML, and B, they give enough time to all the stakeholders to present their views so they can potentially come up with a more moderated approach in terms of the final guidance.
Thank you, Mriganka. I think in summary, we can conclude that this is not an easy issue to address, and we welcome the extension or rather delay. So we assume that the FATF looking at the responses that all of us participated in. And I think it's going to be an interesting month, October, when we see what comes out and how we will respond to that. So finally, I'd just like to thank my guests for the interesting discussion today. And that's it. Thank you. Goodbye.